Hi friends, welcome back to this economics marathon, the Econothon, live from the World Bank Group here in Washington, D.C. We're going to be live for the next 23 hours. We've already had our first hour. I hope you're having fun. You're already hearing from some of the bank's top economists as we discuss some of the biggest issues in development today. It's just past 1 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. It's 5 p.m. in Accra. It's 6 p.m. in my hometown of Cork City, and it's already tomorrow in Kuala Lumpur. I'm Valerie Hickey. I'm going to be your host for this next hour. Please join in. We're here to talk to you, but we want to listen to you too. We want to hear from you. So please send us your comments, your questions on Scribble Live. Tell us who you are. Tell us where you're speaking to us from. And we're going to give you a shout out on the air. We're going to have an exciting hour this hour. Here's a sneak peek. We're ready to start our first conversation this hour. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to a woman who needs absolutely no introduction here in the halls of the World Bank or around the world. It's our CEO, Kristalina Giorgieva. She's going to be talking to us about one of the biggest topics we deal with at the bank. You know, we're a bank whose mission is to end poverty, to help countries and communities build pathways out of poverty and into the middle class. One of the biggest obstacles right now to building that pathway is climate change and resilience. We're in danger of losing 100 million people who made that hard journey from poverty into the middle class. They're going to fall back into poverty if we don't figure out how to deal with climate change. Kristalina, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie, and welcome to the second hour of our 24 hours Econothon. I have with me two bright, fabulous economists, Julie Rozenberg and Martin Heger, and they wrestle with a tough set of economic questions. They are about the economics of adaptation, the economics of resilience. Why is this so critically important for an institution like the World Bank? Because climate change is already hammering everybody, but in particular poor countries and poor people. Take the example of Africa. It has contributed merely 4% of the CO2 emissions, but already 65% of people in Africa are hit by droughts, by hurricanes, by cyclones. They are struggling to cope with the implications of a changing climate. The good news, though, is that the same way we can fight climate change by reducing emissions, we can adapt to its consequences. And what we want to talk to you about is the stories there are, but also the hard economics that underpins what the bank is driving in adaptation. On climate, we put our money where our mouth is. We are the largest financier of climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. Over the next 5 years, we will fund at least $200 billion of climate investments. And we have made a conscious choice to lift up investing in adaptation so people can live with the changing climate, not die because of it. So let me start with Julie. She's going to tell us how an organization like ours, a big development organization, integrates climate adaptation and resilience and why we do that.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. It is true, we have gathered now all the evidence that poor people and poor countries are going to be more affected by climate change than the rest of the population. And actually, the first thing I did at the World Bank when I arrived was work on this shockwaves report and calculated the number of people who would fall back into poverty. And so this is where these 100 million people come from in 2030, and actually it was more 120 million people. But the important message in that report was that this is in the absence of good development. But if you factor in good development and adaptation to climate change, then you can reduce most of these impacts. And so the role of the World Bank would be to work with countries on integrated climate change into all of those development policies. And we want to avoid them to be locked into development patterns that will be dangerous maybe 20, 50 years from now. Because right now, developing countries are building most of their infrastructure networks. And a road, a power plant, once you've built it, it's impossible to move it, it's impossible to sell it. And so you're stuck with it for 20, 30 years. So it's really important that today, when countries invest, they realize that maybe in 20 years, the country will look different and the climate will look different. And that needs to be taken into account now. And the World Bank is uniquely placed to work with countries on this because even though adaptation is really a local issue, it actually requires global knowledge. And the World Bank can gather all the knowledge, can gather all the expertise that's required. One thing that we do often is those kind of technical knowledge exchanges where we bring counterparts from countries with experts from other countries. For example, 2 years ago, we brought counterparts from many countries to Korea to talk about how to adapt water systems and water infrastructure to climate change and how to plan better. So I think...
Well, this is really very important to press and press again that if we factor how the world would look like with a changing climate 10, 15, 20, 30 years into the future, we can make investment decisions today that protect our children and our grandchildren then. And I know that in our work we have come up with this very impressive data that says if we only spend 3% more in investment in infrastructure, we can save over the lifetime of these investments $4.2 trillion. And that is a huge, huge positive economics of that investment. I want to turn to Martin. I was in Bangladesh virtually a week ago. Bangladesh is a remarkable country, highly vulnerable, but also hugely committed to build resilience for its people. And one of the examples that always come to mind is in 1970, cyclone killed somewhere between 300 and 500,000 people in Bangladesh. Similar strength cyclone just in May this year killed less than 10. Every life lost is a tragedy, but the contrast between then and now is just phenomenal. And it came from systematic work on building resilience. So if you can tell our viewers, what is it that countries can do to make that choice of investment that protects people, protects livelihoods?
Yeah, there's really a vast array of options that is at the disposal of countries, and maybe I cluster them in 3 buckets and touch upon them in sequence. But to stay with your Bangladesh example, so one thing that we've seen, for example, as a consequence of some of these natural disasters that hit the country, the cyclones, notably, for example, Ayla, agricultural fields where they used to grow rice were flooded and inundated with salt water. So they had no choice but to adapt. So what the local and national government of Bangladesh did with support from the World Bank was to start growing mud crabs in some of these flooded paddies and also shrimp, etc. And then some of these farmers now are actually better off than they were before because some of these goods or commodities are highly valuable and traded in the market. So that's what I would say, what I would put in the first bucket of saying switching to a more climate resilient, a new normal type of activity. Another example that I'd like to give generally is doing something that you're already doing, but doing it climate smarter. And that can be in agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, whatever have you. A good example for this I'd like to give is also the bank helped Niger, for example, in allowing farmers to get their hands on more resilient seeds, millet seeds, and cassava cuttings. So now they're more heat stress tolerant and more water scarcity tolerant, which then in turn allows the farmers to be much more resilient to climate shocks. And then the third bucket is where I would generally call somewhat switching to a climate smart activity and / diversification, if you wish. For example, in Morocco, we have an interesting project which looks at coastal zone management and what we actually call integrated coastal zone management. And what we've seen is because of rising temperatures, ocean temperatures in particular, sardines, which used to be a mainstay, a staple of fisher folk in these areas, have been significantly impacted. And if we talk to fishery specialists and aquaculture specialists, they'll tell you that sardines are the most temperature-sensitive fish species.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, neither did I. One learns because luckily as economists at this place we are talking to tremendous experts in their respective fields, whether it's forestry or fishery in this instance. And so what happened is that the sardines move away and get killed in large instances because some of their upwelling areas where they lay their larvae and they're repopulated have been significantly impacted, therefore now reducing the income of these fisher folk substantially. So what part of the project was doing was helping them with algae culture. So now they diversified away from solely be reliant on fishery to also return to substitute their livelihoods with algae culture, which helps, by the way, also consumption smooths because fisheries used to be, sardine fisheries, a 3 to 4 months thing, and this is an all-year activity. So, and I have more examples to share,
They're great. My favorite example, it is actually from Bangladesh, is farmers in a country that gets flooded regularly switch from chicken to ducks, because when the flood comes, chicken die, ducks swim. And that is actually the big point about adaptation, that there are, of course, high-tech solutions, but there are also lots of things that can be done that improve the livelihoods of people, great for resilience. And this is the role of the bank, to be a transmission line, to bring this knowledge from one place to another. So I'm going to go back to Julie. When we think about this transmission line of knowledge, what is it that works best to make the case for adaptation to policymakers, the ministers of finance we mostly deal with, and how can we make this case also from the perspective of our core mission, fighting poverty? What do you have to share?
Well, I think one thing we do to talk to Ministry of Finance is those economic analysis, is showing to countries the cost of inaction. Because countries today see that they will have to adapt, and they've started to adapt, especially at the community level. But at the government level, it's still hard to see why it should be a priority. And so by putting the evidence on the table.
Because the time horizon of governments is shorter than the action that needs to be taken? Why is
that
it
is, that is one of the barriers. And actually, I think one of the barriers is because, so it's true that the costs and the actions that have to be taken are now, but the benefits are, first of all, pretty invisible, and they're also spread over the long term. And because those benefits, they're avoided losses. And politicians, they rarely get rewarded for something that they've avoided. They get rewarded for what they've done. And so there's little incentive for them to think that to act on this as a priority.
Yeah. Well, and it is also true that it is very easy to communicate a disaster, floods that take lives.
Yes.
Very difficult to communicate preventing the loss of life. And this is where the language of economics has to be used more. In your experience, what is the phrase, the argument that carries the day, that you have used with policymakers and boom, they get it?
Well, usually it's the numbers, actually. In one of my projects in Colombo, I was working in Colombo in Sri Lanka on flood management. We did an analysis to show them how much they would lose in terms of flood losses if they were to lose their wetlands, if they failed to protect them, because the wetlands in the city act as the flood protection.
Right.
And we found that they could lose on average 1% of GDP per year of the city's GDP if they lost the wetlands. And that has a big impact because it's striking. They've had big flood impacts before, so it's still in their memory. They know what it means.
Right.
And right away they can see, oh, okay, this is important. And then we can actually show them that the cost of doing it is usually much lower than the cost of inaction.
$1 to $7. $1 invested in resilience, $4 to $7 saved.
Exactly.
So to those who watch us, this is an investment not to be missed on. It's a great investment.
It's a great investment.
Martin, now, one of the things we are doing here is to talk to people to say, well, economists can tell you interesting stories, and economics could be fun. It can also be kind of crazy. Economists sometimes come up with really crazy ideas. Can you pitch something to our audience that is in this category of crazy idea?
Right.
To make adaptation work.
Right. So for one thing, I do want to say I work in mitigation as well as in adaptation. And I think that those of us who work in mitigation have the crazier ideas in terms of economists, whether it's pricing carbon, cap and trade, offsetting emissions, so you can emit somewhere, but you can offset it elsewhere. I think in mitigation, the economists oftentimes set the bold ideas and also have the solutions. In adaptation, we steal these crazy ideas from experts, on fisheries experts, forestry experts, agricultural experts. And as with the examples that I mentioned, but also, for example, using oyster beds to create livelihoods, but also protect coastal shores, using seagrass to do the same. Sea moss, coral reef rehabilitation, not only for tourism, but also for flood protection. Investing in restoration of mangroves, which not only act as this protection from impact from a storm surge or coastal floods, but also for habitat for fish and therefore good for fishermen, etc. And at a fraction of the cost of what the equivalent grey infrastructure would be, which would be, say, building barriers, water pumps, or whatever you would have to protect the shores from flooding. So with that, I want to say is, in adaptation, I see our role as economists much more in empowering the agronomists, the foresters, the fisheries experts, whomever, to make the economics work behind their crazy adaptation ideas.
Yep.
And yeah.
Well, I mean, when I listen to you, what is so very clear is that in this area of resilience, if we can make the case that when we help nature, nature can help us.
Absolutely.
That would be win-win-win. It is good for our planet. We leave it to the future generations in good shape. It is good for countering the force of nature, and it creates more livelihoods today.
Absolutely.
In my book, it may not be crazy, but the most important idea on adaptation that matches what you said about mitigation is pricing risk. On mitigation, we are making progress more where we price carbon. When a country puts a tax on carbon, or a price on carbon to be traded, that creates the incentive to reduce emissions. On adaptation, if we can only price risk the same way to create the same incentive for people to adapt, we would be in a much better shape. There is one more difference between mitigation, which is where the world has made more progress, and adaptation, where we are a little bit kind of slow to step up, and it is the role of private sector. On mitigation, it is now common that private investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean mobility, I drive a Tesla, electric cars, this is all viable, but private sector is still trying to find its way to step into adaptation. Why?
Well, there are many reasons. There are market failures and the fact that we don't price risk very well, and it's not always feasible to price it. And one way of dealing with this is by making risk information more transparent. Right now, if I'm an investor and I want to invest some of my savings, I have no information about what is a resilient project and what is not a resilient project. And so one thing where a lot of progress has to be made is on providing the right information on resilience, putting together the right data on what was the process that was followed to make this investment, so that now I know it will actually deliver the benefits it's supposed to deliver. And that's something that we're working on at the World Bank, because that's part of the Climate Change Action Plan that was announced earlier, that we will rate all of our projects based on their resilience. And so we're working on this system, which is actually more complicated than you think, because you don't want to have a rating system that's just based on where the project is located. Because we still want to have investments in areas that are risky, but we want to make those designs better, and we want to plan those investments better so that we know they'll be resilient.
Right. One of the very interesting innovations the bank recently brought up was to turn to crowdsourcing of ideas for adaptation. And the first area we did it in was housing. So we turned to the world's architects and we said, can you build a resilient home for under $10,000? And then to our surprise, boom, many people came up with fabulous projects. Can this crowdsourcing work on other aspects of resilience, like seeds, or can we use it to find faster solutions for the future?
It's a good question. I think we could certainly, more brains have more ideas generally, right? So I certainly, and there, we always see a symmetry of information. We go somewhere and are flabbergasted that this obvious solution hasn't been pondered.
Right.
And in some instances, it's literally creating flood maps because there were no flood maps, and people didn't know how to retreat and where to retreat if a flood comes, or how to plan coastal adaptation facing that. So we're always flabbergasted. So I suppose it is absolutely one way to crowdsource.
Right. So as economists, what question would you put out that is to energize thinking around the economics of adaptation, the economics of resilience? What would be your dream of a question that people would focus their minds to answer?
Well, I don't know if it's so much a question as a state of mind, because to me, climate change adaptation is really not about the incremental cost, about this small thing that you need to pay to make everything better. It's about thinking about everything differently and planning differently. And actually, I have a great example where we've worked with the water utility in Lima, because they wanted our help to see whether or not their master plan was resilient to climate change. And by helping them look at the plan and look at how the different investments would perform in the future given climate change impacts, we actually helped them save $600 million. Because just by looking at it differently, we realized that there were many investments they had planned that would not increase the reliability of the system,
Right.
but that they could think about other solutions like demand management and nature-based solution. And so by thinking about their future and the future of the city differently, they actually saved a lot of money.
Excellent point. So we are going to land on that. Mindset change ought to come because the climate is already changing. Even if we are successful to stay at or below 1.5 degree, that is already a change to which we need to adapt. And that adaptation requires thoughtful thinking with two sets. One, development is the best resilience builder. But two, development has to be thought through from the perspective of the world of tomorrow, not of yesterday. It has been great to talk to my young, smart, dynamic colleagues. They have a lot of work to do because this is a big topic upon us. And it is our world that we want to keep beautiful, healthy, functional, that this discussion has been all about. Back to you, Valerie, for the third hour, well, the third segment of this Econothon. Bye from us.
Thank you, Kristalina. That was a fantastic discussion. You know, those straightforward examples that the three of you provided, the case of Bangladesh is going to sit with me tonight when I think about how many hundreds of thousands of people no longer are at risk. Those are families, millions of people who aren't losing family members. Every death matters, but the more we can do on resilience matters more. So thank you very much. Everybody, I hope you're providing us comments on Scribble Live. We're about to go discuss them. Here's a quick video, very quickly, to just show us what we're doing and how you can talk to us on social media. So I'm going to hope that that is going to roll. Zubida, you're back with us.
Yes,
Wasn't that a
indeed.
fascinating discussion?
I know. I learned a lot about sardines and chickens and
ducks.
That is very true.
What are we hearing on Scribble Live?
We are hearing lots of things, and thank you, our online engaging, for sending your tweets, your comments in Scribble Live. But before we kind of, share some of these comments, we're going to introduce a fun segment. We are introducing a poll, and we're inviting your online audience to participate. The question in the poll is, what is the biggest development challenge countries face today? Is it food security, job creation, climate mitigation and adaptation, debt, gender and inclusion, health and education? Please head on over to Scribble Live and start taking the poll. We would be sharing the results towards the end of the 24-hour Econothon. But here is a feel of what you, our online audience, are sharing in the comments. Ogunla John says the world is faced with several challenges ranging from climate change, terrorism, and inequality. It is time to come up with strategies that should include making government in developing countries to embark on more policies that can speedily touch the lives of the poor.
I'm guessing Alguna is going to have problems picking that one item in the poll.
That is very true.
Issues.
There's a lot of options. And another one tweeted, her name is Shambhavi Tiwari, and she says she's excited to be watching the World Bank Econothon tonight. It's a great way to learn about the most pressing issues in development economics. And she's looking forward to learning about the World Bank's approach to women's empowerment and economic development, particularly in South Asia.
And you're going to be learning about that. And let me tell you, one of the reasons we can have this conversation is because of the digital transformation. The whole way we can open the doors to the World Bank, something that she's enjoying and many of our listeners are enjoying, is because we live in a world that has been transformed by the digital revolution. Wouldn't you know it? We have a Director of Digital Development here at the World Bank. I'm delighted to be joined by Boutheina Guermazi, who's our Director of Digital Development, Guermazi, what does digital have to do with development?
A lot. Actually, there is a significant shift in how we think about development. And only a few years back, when we think about digital, we think about it as a luxury, something good to have, but we never thought about it as a key ingredient for development. So this is changing. It's changing because technology is evolving very fast. It's changing because whatever sector we can talk about today, without having digital as part of it, it will delay the development process. So we know a little bit more about the importance of digital, and I think the importance of digital is also emphasized by the fact of those who don't have access to it will be completely, cut off the digital revolution. We know more. We know that digital sector is the sector that is moving faster than the other traditional sectors of the economy. We know that the contribution of digital is expected to increase by many factors. We know that because of the impact of technology on innovation, on inclusion, it impacts lives of people, it impacts how firms work and deliver, and it impacts how governments interact with citizens. So the fear part of it, if we don't take it really seriously, is, we know this year actually was the year where everybody's celebrating a great milestone. Like the whole world reached 50% of connectivity. So it's wonderful, and everybody is celebrating this. But
what
it took
about
us
the other 50%?
Exactly. And it took us 50 years to reach that milestone. So is it going to take us another 50 years to do that? So that's the fear. And without a deliberate approach of looking at digital development as a key ingredient for development, I think we need to be extremely serious about it. And I'm very serious that the bank is really taking it very seriously.
And Boutheina, from your platform, you get to see what's going on across the world in this space. Is there a particular example that you could give us of something the bank has done to help get us past that 50%, to help accelerate so the next 50% isn't going to take another 50 years?
Yes. So we're working very closely with a number of partners on this. And I can take the example of specifically on Africa, where, the continent is, asking very loudly about how can we leapfrog development by taking advantage of digital development. So we're working very closely with the Broadband Commission to develop an action plan on how do we get those who are connected to be connected as fast as possible. And we're looking at a mix of technology. The bank is a technology neutral, so whatever gets us connected is a good way. We're looking at innovative business models. We're looking at trying to understand why there are segments of the market that are not covered. Sometimes it's, policy regulatory failure. Sometimes it's need for more investment. We're applying the MFD project, the process.
Maximizing finance for development.
Exactly. So creating the enabling condition for the private sector to cover as much as possible, but also understanding the limits and working with the private sector and working with partners to make sure that the connectivity will be there for those who need it and without waiting an additional 50 years.
So I know one of our Vice President for Sustainable Development, Laura Tuck, is always talking about the need for an analog foundation for the digital revolution, the need for credible, robust regulation and credible institutions to transform that regulation into empowerment for people. How would you rate many countries in terms of the institutions and the laws they have so they can harness the digital revolution for empowerment, for economic progress, for development?
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, the analog foundations are very important for the digital revolution, and it has to do with people, with institutions, with the whole regulatory framework. And as we think about digital economy, we look at the foundational element or the analog element as a key pillar. And it's as important as infrastructure and skills and e-application. So the issue with institutions and regulation in a sector that is moving really fast, there is a mismatch between the speed by which the technology is going and the speed by which policymakers and regulators are adapting. And most of the policy and regulatory environment was created in a space where voice was dominating. It's no longer the case. When we talk about digital economy, it's really data economy. And with convergence of voice and data and of content and conduit, I mean, even the very definitions that we used to know before in terms of regulation are being questioned. So this is a top priority for us as we work with our clients to make sure that, they keep updating their policy and regulatory framework. There are some areas that need serious rethinking from scratch. Right. So it's an exciting area, and at the end, it's not about technology. Technology is just a means to an end, but having this ecosystem approach that looks at people, institutions, regulation, which reinforces the message of the importance of analog as we talk about digital.
Does anything keep you up at night when you talk about the speed at which digital is moving and the speed at which it's evolving? I know we hear an awful lot in the popular press about fake news, about data hacks. The digital transformation is all about data, as you said. It's about how do you think about the issues of privacy? How do you think about the issues of enabling more people to have access without enabling bad actors to do bad things?
Great question. Great question, because, as we think about digital development, we also need to be very careful about the risks that come with that. And there are several risks. One is the risk of exclusion. So those with access are moving faster than those without, and we need to be worried about creating a new class of poor, the ones that we call the digital poor, because being digital poor is more difficult given how the technology is evolving. Within the exclusion dimension, there is a big gender dimension, and 40% of women in Africa are less likely to use mobile internet. 58% in South Asia are less likely to use the internet. So I mean, the numbers are shocking, right? In a space where we're moving to intelligent connectivity. So we are in a space that we don't only count connectivity to people, we're counting to connectivity to things. We're talking about the internet of everything. Now, everything
has to be the internet of everyone.
Exactly. So this, the gender dimension, I think, is if we don't look at it very deliberately, I think we're excluding women from being part of this digital economy.
Thank you, Boutheina. This is fantastic. We're talking about gender a lot this morning, and we're going to go from one extremely strong woman on digital. We're going to have my colleague Aaditya Mattoo come and is going to talk to another extremely strong woman here at the bank, Penny Goldberg, our chief economist. But before we do that, let's watch a quick video about digital transformation in action.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you our future. Our future. Y'all get ready, this is for everybody. Try to catch up, we out ahead. Let me introduce to you. Try to catch up, we out ahead. That future hit. Are you ready? That future hit. It's automatic. Ooh. Amazing how it's happening. Look at how we made it. Ooh. That future. That future. 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 Are you ready? Future hit. Future. Future. Future.
We are fortunate to have here today Penny Goldberg, World Bank Chief Economist, someone I've admired from a distance and now I'm privileged to work with her. So Penny, as someone who has spent a long time in rigorous reflection and is now engaged in development action, do you think we have a good understanding of what drives development?
By now, we have a very good understanding of what development is. What development is having high human capital, so having good health and good education, having good institutions, having adequate infrastructure in a country, and also having very good jobs. And what I mean by jobs is good jobs in the formal economy that pay well, that they provide benefits and security to people. So I think there is agreement on this issue. The big question is, how do we get there? Where do we start? This is the big question, and there is less agreement on that front. Another issue is that economists have become increasingly aware of the fact that the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work, that what may work very well for one country may not work that well in a different context. And finally, I would say that over the last few years, we learned, sometimes the hard way, that implementation matters, that it's not just what you do, it's how you do it. And good, careful implementation is key to development.
Penny, you began by identifying a set of factors which at various points of time have been seen as silver bullets. Mm-hmm. You know, human capital is now back in fashion, but there was a time where Lan Pritchett wrote this very influential piece called "Where Has All the Education Gone?" And then education was not a priority anymore. So sometimes, like economies have cycles, development economics tends to have cycles. And what do you make of these? Have we learned new things about old bullets, or has the world changed, which makes us take a different view?
What we've learned is that in reality, there is no silver bullet, that it takes more than making progress on one front to achieve development. We need to work at the same time on all fronts. Now, for us, you know, as economists, it's easy to say that when we sit in the research department. What you hear from policymakers is we need to prioritize. So they need us to tell them where should we start, what comes first, because countries often don't have the capacity to work on all fronts simultaneously. And not surprisingly, then we end up with cycles and fads, as you said. So sometimes it's all about human capital, sometimes it's all about physical infrastructure. The truth is that if a country works only on one front and not on others, it's not going to achieve sustained growth. Human capital is one example. There is no question that human capital is extremely important. It's key to development. But at the same time, human capital is one of what we label as long-term fundamentals. It takes a long time to build human capital. It takes 10, 20 years. So the question that policymakers face is, while we build this human capital, while we work on improving education and health, how do we create jobs? How do we make sure that people have to eat? How do we make sure that we stay in power? So these are questions that policymakers are confronted with.
You also said, you know, no one size fits all, and you have been a very influential trade economist, and if there is one model of development which has really produced powerful benefits, it's the East Asian, with labor-intensive production destined for export markets. Mm-hmm. But it's proved incredibly difficult to transfer that model to other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, even South Asia. Why?
First, let me say that this model has been proven extremely successful, ex post. And it's a model that's very appealing from a development point of view because it's a model that's logically coherent. It gives one a very good idea of how development can be achieved, even for small countries, even in the case of countries that do not have good institutions yet, or countries that do not have the human capital yet. And the idea is that you focus, you exploit what you're best at, which is having a lot of labor, cheap labor. You specialize in the production of goods that use this cheap labor, and then you sell them in export markets. Therefore, you don't need to have a large economy yourself, and you don't need rich markets. You don't need rich consumers in your own country. You can tap on lucrative export markets abroad. So that's the beauty of this model. It's a logically coherent model, but it gives one a sense of how it can work in the case of countries that do not yet have the capabilities to build human capital or build good institutions. And so this model, as you said, has been extremely successful in East Asia. We've seen less success in other parts of the world, especially in Africa and in South Asia, and there are many reasons for that. So one reason is that the success in East Asia makes it much harder for countries that came late into this process to succeed, because many markets are already served by East Asian countries. So countries in Africa or South Asia face much more competition compared to the past. A second reason is that these days we experience an enormous backlash against globalization. So the advanced countries are not as open to trade as they were in the past. And this poses a challenge to the old model of development. And finally, there are also many concerns about technology, and in particular about automation. Instead of using cheap labor, many firms can use machines now. So the question is there, is cheap labor still going to be valuable? As you know, you worked on the World Development Report this year, which is on trade, and we looked at these questions a little bit. Actually, our message from the World Development Report tends to be an optimistic one, that we think there is still a path to growth, despite automation, despite technology, that we find that technology still creates jobs more than it takes away. But nevertheless, there is this anxiety out there as to whether countries can still succeed the old way.
I think, Penny, you're absolutely right that, the report that we produce and which we're going to discuss later today does have optimistic conclusions about technology, less so about protectionism. I think that is a real Damocles sword that hangs over the development prospects of other countries. But just going back to human capital for a second, even in East Asia, we see big differences. A country like Cambodia has also broken into global value chains, but for the most part has shown little sign of progression beyond simple manufacturing. But on the other hand, a country like Vietnam has already advanced into electronics and other more sophisticated products. And one thing quite striking about it is that how much better Vietnam does, not just than Cambodia, but even a country like Malaysia, which is much richer in terms of educational quality. So let me ask you a provocative question. We also see Eastern Europe doing really well. So is it possible that the best route to capitalist growth is to go through a period of socialism and egalitarian distribution of education and assets?
I'm not sure if it's socialism, but what's really important in that you pointed out is that it's not enough for countries to generate jobs, as Vietnam did originally, as Korea did. Then they need to take the next step and invest in education, invest in people. And when I say education, invest in education, it's not enough to invest in the education of a few, in the education of an elite. that runs the country, it's important to invest in the education of everyone, to make sure that the population as a whole rises. And the countries that manage to achieve sustained growth are precisely the countries that were willing to make these investments. And you mentioned the countries in Eastern Europe. These are countries that have an extremely educated workforce. Korea is another example, Vietnam. So these are China. These are countries that did benefit from this model of export-led industrialization, but they didn't stop there. They also invested in human capital. And so coming back to the question we posed originally, this is a case where the development model they adopted was one where they started by focusing on job generation and job growth. They generated jobs. This created the fiscal capacity to invest in education, and there was also the willingness of governments, of the state, to make these investments. And so they managed to take it to the next stage. The big question in this Economist is if they're willing to now invest in institutions, right? This is the third important component in development. You need human capital, you need jobs, but you also need to improve your institutions. And so if they achieve that, then they're going to achieve sustained growth.
So Penny, the examples that you're giving about the types of investment in education make me think about India. Mm-hmm. And you said about creating jobs. It's also a country which has seen uneven investments. You know, we have few islands of excellence, but also large swaths of deprivation. And India has seen, in a way, its comparative advantage strangely manifested in services. But there is a concern that that growth has come, but it hasn't generated the kind of jobs that have come from more manufacturing-led development. But you've thought about India a lot. What do you see as interesting? Because you are getting growth, and you've pointed this out. Where is that growth coming from? And might there be relevance of India's experience for Africa?
I think this is a very interesting question. I think the case of India is particularly interesting these days. When we try, especially in the World Bank, we try to reduce poverty in Africa. So that's where poverty is concentrated, that's where the big challenge is. And so when we approach the development challenge in Africa, one question is, what's our vision for the future? What model of development should we apply to Africa? I think many people think that the model that was applied, the model that China applied, or East Asia may not be applicable to Africa. For a variety of reasons, I already mentioned that there is increasing automation, backlash against globalization. Against this background, India may serve more as a model than China, and there are many reasons for that. India is a very large country. It's a very heterogeneous country. It's not a country that has particularly good institutions, most people would say. It's not a country that has, even though it has an educational elite, the Nobel Prize winners were from India. In general, it's not a country known for its high human capital. It's a country with huge inequalities. So in many ways, the experience in India mirrors that of many developing countries. India has been growing a lot in the last few years. So the growth rates have been consistently above 6%, and it's not growth that's driven by exports. So what drives growth, and perhaps there are many important lessons we can learn from India, and we can apply them to Africa. So let me offer a few thoughts. No one has the full answer yet, but just a few thoughts. India did engage in a series of very important reforms in the early 90s. Among other things, India liberalized trade. One important insight from research is that the biggest benefit of this liberalization was through imports, not through exports. And this was partly because India managed to get through imports, through the liberalization, access to inputs that they did not have before.
Both goods and services.
Both goods and services. So this is a case where the benefits did not come by selling abroad. The benefits came from importing from abroad. So they did open up the markets. They did engage in a series of domestic reforms that, to a certain extent, helped integrate the domestic market. They're still not there. The markets are still highly segmented and fragmented in India, but compared to the past, India is in a much better place. All this seems to have contributed to growth, and perhaps all these lessons that we can learn from studying India can be applied to Africa as well.
So, Penny, if I think of development economics, there was a time there was a focus on these economy-wide macroeconomic growth models like the Solo model or structural transformation models like the Lewis model. But increasingly, the focus is much more on rigorous evaluation of micro interventions, often through randomized control trials. Then we look at the evidence on aid. And again, this aggregate cross-country evidence comes to inconclusive, at best, results. But the micro evidence, whether it's on bed nets or vaccines or deworming, is much more compelling and persuasive. How would you reconcile this macro pessimism with micro pessimism? And where should the focus of our analytical work be? We only have about a couple of minutes, so
we have a couple of minutes. But let me start with your second question, because this is easy to answer. I think we should be doing both. The two approaches are complementary. Sometimes it's easier to answer the specific questions than micro questions. You know, how do we make sure that that people don't get malaria? You know, how do we make sure they stay healthy? We can make concrete progress through concrete interventions. But at the same time, we also need to work on the macro vision, on a conceptual framework that will help inform our approach towards development. So the two approaches are complementary. I don't see them as competing against each other. And I very much hope in the World Bank and the research department we'll keep working on both fronts.
Thank you very much, Penny. I hope we will bridge the gap between saying the narrow with great conviction and the broad with little strong evidence, but your presence here will be a huge asset. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaditya. Thank you so much, Penny. Everybody, I hope you heard the optimism that was discussed today. Penny used the word herself. There may not be a silver bullet, but there's silver buckshot. There's lots of really good ideas, lots of really good solutions that are out there that are being tried in different countries, that are being shared across countries. There's a contagion of good ideas. And as we close this second hour and we start our third hour, we're about to go do some deep dives in the regions to hear about just how those ideas and solutions are being applied in particular country context. I'm delighted to say that Latin America and the Caribbean, my own region, is up first. Stay tuned, stay engaged, and we'll be back in just one moment.